presentation on which watcher watches the watcher.
Say that 10 times.
Hello. I have a microphone. This is a dangerous thing. Okay, thanks for coming along. Thanks to the organisers. About me, I'm a sysadmin, although I'm a little uncomfortable about the connotations of sysadmin. Sysadmin to me is that guy who lives in the server room and writes Perl scripts and stuff and racks up servers. I'm not really doing that sort of stuff anymore, so I'm sort of a DevOps, but DevOps is a professional and cultural movement. It's not a person, so I'm not a DevOps. I've worked in operations teams, so maybe I'm an operations engineer or something like that. The companies I've worked for, they've always been web-focused companies, so maybe I'm web operations. That's some of the companies I work for. I guess the thing I'm particularly interested in is metrics and monitoring, which is the topic I'm talking about tonight. I run another meetup group called Infocoders with a friend Matt Jones. And yeah, I've been doing cloud stuff for the last 2 years, in AWS for the last 2 years. So when I'm in a bar and someone asks me what I do, I've recently been saying I drive websites. And I'm going to come back to this car analogy a fair bit. So what does that mean? So driving websites, it means I work with the developers. The developers create the things that I drive. But I'm an ops kind of guy, so anything not build related or not code related is stuff that I do. So gather telemetry and metrics on systems, use those graphs to make decisions about infrastructure, capacity, how are things working. I'm particularly interested in how things are performing, where the bottlenecks are. And the easiest thing in cloud environments is to over-provision. It's just easy to click a button and fire up a server. It's really fun. So yeah, cost versus performance trade-offs, that sort of stuff. And of course, fixing things when they break. That's the life of an ops person. And I work with my good friends, the developers. So they build the things that I drive. And this is sort of what they think they build. Something that performs really well and is red and goes fast. This is sort of my opinion, is what they sometimes actually build, so it's a little bit funky. Sometimes works, mostly works. And this is kind of how I see myself. Driving this website. And to be fair, this is probably how they see me. A little bit funky. Okay. I will get into the main part of the talk soon. So I want to talk about dashboards briefly. This is the dashboard of my car. I drive a Ford Focus. I like it. And so the car dashboard is something that's been road tested by many thousands of millions of people for 100 years, and the UI is pretty good. So it tells you how fast you're going, and how hard the engine's working, and I can see at the moment there's no alerts, so nothing's broken. There's no warnings going off at the moment. And implicit in the sort of the UI of the car dashboard is the thresholds. So it kind of tells me, well, I can go to 200 kilometers an hour for the car explodes, maybe. Red line is kind of 7,000 RPM, and we've got thresholds around fuel. It tells us how far we can go, and oil temperature, and other sorts of things. So the analogy with a typical web dashboard, and this is a NewRelic dashboard, it's got many of the same sort of things. So how fast are we going? There's a couple of different ways of measuring this. So latency in milliseconds to generate a page, and also there's the other part of that is, so my servers generate a page in sort of 250 milliseconds, and your browser might take 5 seconds to render that page, including time to download all the assets and CPU and browser and all that sort of stuff. So that's fast we're going. The throughput is measured in RPM, which is kind of convenient with the tachometer analogy. Instead of revolutions per minute, we've got requests per minute. That's how fast the engine's spinning in the web app. And measuring if something's broken, that's a little bit more difficult. There's a bunch of apps that can measure that sort of thing. We've got Nagios, we've got Sensu, and they talk to other things. And yeah, thresholds. Yeah, this is an interesting thing. So back in the car dashboard, the thresholds are quite easy to see. With a web app, sort of different because with a web app you're driving along and you can actually alter a lot of those parameters. You can fire on more servers or change all sorts of parameters as you're running. So finding bottlenecks and in a typical complex web app, you've got things like load balancers, app servers, database servers, caching layers, CDNs. It's kind of hard, and it's if you find someone who's really good at load testing, yeah, totally worth their weight in gold. It's a very hard skill. Alright, so that's sort of an introduction, and hopefully I got the point across that to be in operations, you need to have a good dashboard, you need to have a good understanding of the metrics that drive the site. So I want to talk about three products that I've used. Librato metrics, Stackdriver, and NewRelic. All slightly different focus. So let's first talk about CloudWatch. So if you're in AWS, you have CloudWatch. CloudWatch surfaces a whole bunch of metrics, and I mean it's a useful thing, but it has some limitations. Let me talk about those. So the big one for me is the 2 weeks. So after 2 weeks, they throw away the data, and that's kind of not very useful. I'd like to be able to see a graph that goes back a month or 2 months or a year. I'd like to know what the database is doing over the course of a whole year. That's useful for me. But it has planning, that kind of thing. And there's some other limitations. So it's kind of hard to build a dashboard using just CloudWatch and surface that information. It's quite popular to have information radiators these days, so screens up on the wall with performance metrics that we can see. Alright, so the UI 6 months ago, whenever they did the UI refresh, was terrible. Now it's awful, but it's better. Another limitation that I mentioned here is it's really useful to be able to overlay what's happening last week with today or yesterday or last month. Can't really do that. Alright, so CloudWatch does have some good points. It's kind of useful for just ad hoc exploration of data, just going through you've probably got many thousands of graphs. It's good for finding things, and you can display a bunch of things on the same graph. That's cool. It's the most up to date. I'll come back to that point later. And you can set thresholds and alert on those. That's kind of useful. Apparently you can push custom metrics into CloudWatch. Now, does anyone actually do that? No? Cool. I've never found a use for that, but some people do. Let's go and have a look at some of these products. So, who uses NewRelic? Probably, yeah. Okay. Surprised there aren't one. In the sort of web space, this is pretty much the standard. I haven't seen anything better for application metrics. So you've got an agent that you install into your PHP or your Ruby or your Java, and it sends all these wonderful metrics back to NewRelic. It's really good. So what I want to talk about tonight is the plugin, so the CloudWatch plugin to NewRelic, which is basically gives you all these extra bits and pieces that you wouldn't see normally. And it's the Stackdriver. Stackdriver is a fairly new product. It's been around 6 months, maybe. And it has has a slightly different focus. It's a bit more ops friendly than NewRelic. NewRelic is very much about the application. Stackdriver is pretty useful from an ops perspective. And again, it's using all the CloudWatch data and builds dashboards and graphs and things, and some extra things. And this is Librato. I'm not so familiar with Librato, but I decided to try it out for this presentation because they fairly recently announced CloudWatch support. So, alright, I'll quickly go through how you install these things. For Librato, you create an IAM group user, give it CloudWatch read-only access, and give that access key and secret key to Librato, and then they can query the API, pull in more metrics. For NewRelic, slightly different. You do the same. You create an IAM group and user, and you need to fire up a server to run a little collector daemon. So you can do that on your own server, or they have an AMI from the marketplace that has it pre-installed. But it's just a Ruby gem, so you install a Ruby gem, you edit the configuration file, and you start the process. And Stackdriver, again, slightly different, but similar. So you create this cross-account access role, and give it third-party access read-only, and then you give Stackdriver the role ARN, and then they pull in the metrics. Okay, here's where I sort of compare the three. So, hope this is useful to some of you guys. So, yeah, big thing, data retention. I like to have, ideally, all the data from the beginning of time, or at least 12 months is good. So that's a sort of failing of NewRelic. And yeah, Stackdriver allegedly keep all the data, but I know Librato, they roll up the data, and NewRelic does that the same. That's kind of annoying. You lose the granularity. Features, we go through this. So obviously all three products let you build custom dashboards, and this is really useful. Lets you create a dashboard that has all the stuff you want to see, and then publish that off to a dashboard screen or something, or just use that data. All three update in real time, so they pull in the data and they refresh. You don't have to touch it. They all lag to some extent, so I don't know if you realise, but the CloudWatch data is not quite up to date. Particularly things like RDS, that's really annoying. So RDS data is 5 minutes delayed. So then when you add on the delay of the third-party service pulling in metrics, sometimes it can be like 10 minutes out of date. This is not so good, particularly if you're in an incident kind of scenario, if something's down, you need those metrics right now. Something to be aware of, and Stackdriver actually tell you how out of date the metrics are. NewRelic's the only one that really lets you compare today with last week or last month. NewRelic and Stackdriver have agents. So the CloudWatch data is obviously querying the hypervisor and getting server metrics from outside. Sometimes it's nice to be able to get metrics from inside. So in this case, the NewRelic agent can give you process information that you wouldn't otherwise get from CloudWatch. And Stackdriver uses collectd, which is quite widely known open source daemon that collects data. It's cool. Librato is a bit more basic. NewRelic has a mobile client, which is actually quite useful. I like it. And all three let you put in custom metrics and events, like you've probably seen deploy lines on graphs. So something happened then, and then the graph went like that. It's really useful. Key benefits. So if you're a web shop and you're using NewRelic, then you may as well suck in the CloudWatch data. It's a no-brainer really. And yeah, it lets you build dashboards and open up that access to those metrics. Stackdriver is a different sort of beast. So NewRelic, it's good for looking at single servers, but not so good dealing with clusters. So these days, I don't really care about individual servers. I'm concerned about clusters and how a cluster of X number of servers is performing. Stackdriver is really good at dealing with clusters. So you can define a cluster on a tag or membership of an ELB or a whole bunch of other things. It's kind of good. And who's looking at their CloudTrail data? So CloudTrail is a fairly new service. It basically logs all the API calls into an S3 bucket. Stackdriver is able to load that data and give you a feed of all the things that have changed in your infrastructure. This is not so useful if you're a single person startup, but if you've got tens or even hundreds of people working on infrastructure, then people are changing stuff all the time, and what you really want to do is find out who changed what and when they did it and what they changed. Yeah, so this is really cool. Stackdriver also has anomaly detection. So what they do is they pull your data and they stuff it into a BR's Cassandra cluster, and they run some batch jobs, and they find out stuff about your data. So what they can do is they can identify if one of the members of a cluster is doing something different to all the others. That's really useful. Humans can do that by looking at a graph and saying, okay, that's doing something different. But to be able to do that in an automated way is cool. They can also detect anomalies in traffic, any sort of metrics. So they can identify spikes, and they can identify troughs and gradual things happening. And they can send you an email or send an alert. So it's pretty useful. Librato is a different sort of beast. If you're familiar with Graphite, I think that's sort of what it does. You throw data at it and it'll make graphs. It doesn't have as much depth as the other products. Cost. These things aren't free. Well, they're all free to trial, and then they start to charge you. NewRelic is sort of free if you're already using NewRelic. You just use the plugin, there's no extra charge. Stackdriver is $12 per resource per month. A resource might be an EC2 instance, or an RDS instance, or an ELB, or any other sort of thing. And Librato's, I won't even go into that. It's not very good. So that's pretty much the end of my talk. I've got some screenshots of the different dashboards. Stackdriver, Librato. Does anybody have any sort of questions about stuff? Yeah.
How long do you use each one for?
So on and off, I've used NewRelic for, I don't know, 6 years or something at different companies. The NewRelic's AWS CloudWatch integration is fairly new. It's been around a few months. So when that came out, I switched it on and started using that. Stackdriver is, again, they only launched their products a few months ago, and I started using it as soon as they, well, actually was in the beta program, so I'm into this stuff. And Librato, I just talked about yesterday to this presentation. Librato is, a lot of people like it. It's pretty simple. You throw data at it, and it makes graphs. Yeah.
Regarding the anomaly detection that you say that Stackdriver does, have you heard of a product called Grok that purports to do the same and how they compare?
What was the name of the product?
Grok.
Grok, isn't it? G-R-O-K.
G-R-O-K.
Yeah.
No, I haven't looked at that.
It works out platforms like without having to pre-code it.
Yeah.
Using some AI thing.
Yeah.
I think he did his PhD thesis on it or something on AI and then built the product or something.
Yeah, this automated anomaly detection stuff is really, I think that's where the technology's at the moment. And, yeah, I'd be interested to have a look at that product too. Yep.
The original dashboard you showed of the car with the dials.
Yep.
Is there anything you found in that space that gives you that? Like, ops type people care about graphs over time, but there are lots of other people that sort of care about instantaneous value and where it sits in relation to thresholds. Like, is there anything all that's the same stack we run, right? But how you turn it another dimension and expose it to a less sophisticated user that can't read the graphs, but just want to look at where are you at from a capacity perspective.
We don't give those people data.
We're trying to encourage them to use data as much as possible, but simplify it.
And a product I've used at a couple of places is Geckoboard, which lets you do those sort of instantaneous views on metrics. But yeah, you're right. So I maybe didn't explain about time series data. Mostly what I want to see is how things are performing over time. Maybe I didn't explain that well.
I think I do.
Yeah.
But there is
Some people want to know, right, how many sales have we made today?
Another good one if you
Single
want to
number.
see is Electron.
That's the other
That's,
one.
yeah.
Electron.
You can drop in all their GA plugins and NewRelic and build one dashboard that brings all the widgets in the world.
Right.
They just wanted to charge it too much.
Yeah, true.
I would love if there was one product that did everything, but yeah.
We'd be out of a job.
No. Any other questions? Which one should you use? If you've got NewRelic or Librato already, definitely use those. Just add in the extra bits and pieces. CloudWatch data. More data is better than less data. Stackdriver is probably more useful if you're a bit bigger and you've got more people working on your infrastructure. But yeah, it's a pretty big product. Anybody else? Okay. Thanks.
All right.
We'll see Dave this time next year with his 5th presentation, I'm sure. For all the guys standing at the back, there are some seats down here at the